Coming up on Arirang News, South Korean President Moon Jae-in says he's sharing his diplomatic duties with the Prime Minister because of Korea's rising status and need to work with other countries. On Thursday, the president is meeting with South Korea's political parties to work on a response to Japan's new export restrictions. The South Korean government and key businesses are planning to respond jointly if Japan decides to take South Korea off its so-called white list of trading partners. In the meantime, Japan ratchets up the tensions with a new demand. And the New York Times says Japan's restrictions set a dangerous precedent by using national security, like the Trump administration, as a justification to cut off trade. It's 4 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. With South Korea's rising status in the world, President Moon Jae-in is emphasizing the need for what he's calling two-top diplomacy, that is, sharing diplomatic duties between himself and Prime Minister Lee Nak-yeon. The president made this point at a cabinet meeting Tuesday in view of the growing importance of diplomacy, especially in terms of the economy and peace. Here's the president.
우리나라는 대통령제이지만 독특하게 국무총리를 두고 있고 헌법상 국무총리에게 행정각부를 통할하는 권한을 부여하고 있습니다. 따라서 우리의 국무총리도 정상급 외교를 할 수 있는 위상을 가지고 있다고 봅니다.
He says Prime Minister Lee's four-nation tour to Bangladesh, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Qatar should be viewed in line with such efforts. He also explained that the PM's diplomatic activities have helped broaden the scope of South Korea's diplomacy and have boosted economic support for Korean companies. A senior Blue House official noted that the president's remarks are also a response to criticism of the prime minister's overseas travel at a sensitive time when trade tensions are rising. President Moon will finally sit down with the leaders of the five main political parties for talks on a wide range of issues, but mainly the ongoing trade spat between South Korea and Japan. The meeting is to be held Thursday afternoon at the Blue House. It was finalized by the parties Tuesday at the National Assembly. The Secretary General of the ruling Democratic Party of Korea, Yoon Ho-jung, told reporters afterwards that they agreed on the need to put aside political differences and work together to minimize the damage to the South Korean economy. It's not been decided who will attend the meeting, but the Presidential Chief of Staff for Policy, Kim Sang-jo, and Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi are expected to be there from the government side. Other issues on the table could include the pending multi-billion-dollar supplementary budget bill. President Moon has formally appointed the reform-minded prosecutor Yoon Seok-yeol as the head of Korea's prosecution service. Presidential office says the appointment was made Tuesday afternoon. Yoon will start a 2-year tenure on July 25th, that's Thursday next week, replacing the outgoing prosecutor general Moon Moo-il, whose term ends the day before. The top office has previously explained that as a prosecutor, Yoon has worked to eradicate corruption, and that his work shows that he's an upstanding individual who is not swayed by outside authority. U.S. President Donald Trump's new point man for East Asia and the Pacific, David Stilwell, will be in South Korea from today through Thursday. Stilwell will meet with senior officials from Seoul's foreign ministry and the presidential office to discuss ways to further strengthen the alliance and boost cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. In an interview last weekend with Japanese broadcaster NHK, he was asked about possible American intervention in the trade dispute between Seoul and Tokyo, to which he said both sides should talk and find a positive way out. A wooden boat believed to be from North Korea was detected off South Korea's east coast on Monday. This is in addition to the 3 unmanned boats from North Korea that were found in South Korea's East Sea last Saturday. They were destroyed after it was confirmed they were not used for spying. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said the boats had drifted south because of bad weather. The latter 3 were submerged, which makes them almost impossible to tow away, but if left untouched, they could be dangerous to other fishing boats. This year, 16 empty North Korean boats have crossed the northern limit line, which is the de facto sea border. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, has urged Iran to go back to full compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal. The EU is trying to find ways it can keep trading with Iran. Mogherini says she wants to mitigate the effect of the U.S. ramping up pressure on Iran by offering relief. Hong Yu reports.
The European Union tried to persuade Iran to change course and return to full compliance of its 2015 nuclear accord. It tried to avoid the collapse of a deal that had proved effective in keeping Tehran from developing nuclear weapons. Iran decided recently not to abide by the terms of the deal, increasing its stockpile of enriched uranium as their relationship with Washington deteriorated. Yet Spanish Foreign Minister Joseph Borrell, who will take over from Federica Mogherini as the EU's foreign policy chief in November, said the deviations are not significant enough to assess that Iran has broken the agreement. In efforts to save the unraveling agreement, the EU is trying to help the Iranian economy that has been crippled due to U.S. sanctions. France, Germany, and the UK have developed a new financial mechanism called INSTEX to continue trading with Iran and skirt Washington's punitive measures.
We know that all our activities would probably not compensate or not get to the level of compensation that follows the decision of the United States. Still, our intention is to try to mitigate the impact of the United States' decision to reimpose sanctions and stop implementing the agreement. So we're trying our best to.
EU nations also blamed the Trump administration for escalating tensions by withdrawing from the deal last year. China, one of the parties in the deal, also said U.S. pressure was the root cause of recent developments and called on the Trump administration to rectify the situation. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
There are roughly 130,000 women in Korea who moved here for marriage. Many of them struggle to overcome social and cultural barriers, as well as problems like domestic violence. But there are a number of migrant women providing leadership and inspiration. Oh Soo-young reports.
Helping foreign brides become more than a typical housewife. That's the #1 mission for Ira, a Mongolian woman who is Korea's first ever politician of foreign descent. Having moved to the country 16 years ago, Lee says she feels more at home in her former constituency of Seongnam than in Mongolia. She was elected to the Gyeonggi-do Provincial Assembly in 2010.
I never even dreamt of being a politician back in Mongolia, but suddenly in Korea I was 33 years old in office, working with budgets and representing the foreign population here.
She may have now left office, but she's sticking to a pledge of giving immigrants a voice through her organisation, which supports women who move to Korea through marriage. Acknowledging the struggles they face in overcoming social and cultural barriers, and even cases of domestic violence, he aims to help migrant women become more independent and entrepreneurial.
It's crucial for women to leave their homes, socialize, and find sources of income. We're working with Seongnam City to train our women in medical tourism so that they can turn their native language skills into a specialized profession.
When Won Ok-gun first moved to Korea with her husband in 1997, she felt trapped at home, unable to speak the language or develop a career. She decided to challenge herself by learning interpretation skills and began helping other foreign wives communicate with their husbands by translating their letters in an online community.
I felt the limitation of simple translations. I wanted to provide more practical support, so I began working with NGOs and became one of the first consultants on the Tanuri Emergency Hotline for migrant women, which has now expanded to 13 different languages.
Won is now a legal interpreter and a representative for the local Vietnamese community.
Throughout the years, I saw how passionately and selflessly Korean activists fought for our rights as migrants. They showed me how I should and could do so much more for my own people, especially women.
Recognized for her efforts, Won was named Seoul's honorary mayor in 2016, a role she says she'll always strive to fulfill. Among the 130,000 women who moved to Korea for marriage, a growing number of them are working to improve social conditions so that others can enjoy their rights to well-being and decent jobs, as well as reach their full potential in Korean society. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
The South Korean government and businesses are working together on a response if Japan decides to go a step further and remove South Korea from its so-called white list of trading partners. In the meantime, Japan has demanded a response by Thursday to its proposal to form a committee to mediate over the issue that set off this trade conflict. Kim Yo-sun has this report.
Tokyo has requested Seoul to respond to its request by Thursday to establish a mediation committee to discuss the South Korean Supreme Court's ruling on the issue of forced labor during Japan's colonial rule. However, the South Korean government says it cannot meet the deadline set unilaterally by Tokyo. Japan is expected to remove South Korea from its so-called white list of countries with minimum trade restrictions under the grounds that Seoul refused to respond to its diplomatic efforts to resolve the issue of wartime forced labor. After receiving feedback from related parties through July 24th, Tokyo will likely deal with the issue during its cabinet meeting and remove Seoul from its white list in late August. However, the schedule could be delayed depending on the results of the Japanese House of Councilors election slated for July 21st. The timeline could also be affected by Seoul's message to Tokyo on its August 15th National Liberation Day. Once Seoul is removed from the white list, over 1,100 items, including advanced tech materials and sensors, would be affected.
It will be difficult to continue the development of future cars. There would be immense repercussions in many areas, including employment.
To this, the South Korean government and businesses are planning to jointly respond to Japan's expected move. Seoul's trade ministry says the government, public institutions, and corporations are devising countermeasures to deal with Japan's trade curbs. It added a supplementary budget will be earmarked for South Korean industries that currently depend heavily on Japan. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, data show that Japan's total exports fell for the 6th consecutive month in May. That was before it announced its trade restrictions. According to the Korea International Trade Association, Japan's exports in May were tallied at roughly $54 billion, down almost 8% on year. They've been steadily declining since last December. Analysts have pointed to slow global growth and falling exports to China as the main factors. They say Japan's situation is not likely to improve in the second half of the year because of its trade conflict with Korea, one of Tokyo's main export destinations. The New York Times says Japan has set a dangerous precedent by justifying its trade restrictions, like the Trump administration's, on national security. They also hurt free and open trade, it says. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
The New York Times criticized Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe for copying U.S. President Donald Trump and citing national security as grounds for curbing the export of high-tech materials to South Korea. The paper reported Monday that Tokyo had alluded to vague threats to its security and echoed Seoul's sentiment that the move was politically motivated. It also referred to Prime Minister Abe's remarks on free trade delivered last month before an audience of world leaders at the G20 summit in Osaka. There, Prime Minister Abe called for, quote, a free and open economy that serves as a foundation of global peace and prosperity. The report then pointed to Prime Minister Abe's contradictory stance of limiting South Korea's access to Japanese chemicals that are essential to its electronics industry. It said Japan had joined countries like the U.S. and Russia in using, quote, vague, unspecified concerns as justification for cutting off trade. Citing experts, the report says such arguments, which have been rarely invoked, are wearing away long-standing global rules intended to keep trade disputes from going out of control. Once they're weakened, the national security exception could be used more often, further damaging the world trade order. The report said more countries like Japan could frequently cite the exception ever since President Trump started to mix national security into his economic policies in promoting his America First initiative. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
It's time now for an in-depth look at the markets this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, global strategist at Kiwoom Securities. Mr. Yu, thanks for coming on today.
Hello.
So U.S. stocks closed again at all-time highs on Monday, though it wasn't as big of a jump this time. It seems there's some caution ahead of earnings season, and now here in Korea, the Kospi at least bouncing back a bit. What's the story today?
Sure. If we look at the U.S. interest rate environment, most of people are expecting somewhere between 25 basis point cuts to 75 basis point cuts till the end of this year. And that was increasing the liquidity in the market, and that has resulted into quite strong equity rally. But in terms of the economic numbers and also the earnings numbers, we are seeing slowdown in U.S. for the second quarter. And the FactSet sheet is saying that, FactSet data is saying that second quarter earnings are expected to be down by 2.6% year on year. So question mark is that it is down, but how much is going to be down, and whether or not this indicates the possibility of U.S. recession in any time soon. So with that, I think that people are being cautious in terms of investing into equities for the time being until the actual rate cut happens on the July 31st. But the study shows that if the Fed rate were cut for the first time after a while, and if that does not link into an economic recession per se, then most of the U.S. market has risen since 1971. And by over the period of 12 months, U.S. market on average rising by 16.5%. So we do still think that there's a momentum for equity market to move up further, and that will have positive implications in the future. But for the short term, we have not seen the rate cut yet for the first time. So I think the market will probably wait until the July 31st. Now, as for the Korean market, with various news, it was slightly up by 0.45% for Kospi. Kosdaq was pretty much flat. Japan, with the news of slowing down in terms of the exports, and the earnings are expected to be weaker, was down by 0.69%. Chinese market, after yesterday's rally, it was pretty much flat.
Got it. Well, there's a report from Reuters citing a former U.S. government official as saying that the Trump administration might let American companies start supplying Huawei again within a couple of weeks. That's created some anticipation for a rebound in stocks related to chips and 5G. How is the market responding?
Yes, with the 5G aspect, it is quite important for the fourth industrial revolutions for global economy. The fourth industrial revolutions would include, foundry business as well as the 5G areas. The reason for that is because of the data center needed and the cloud business needed in order to improve this business side. And that clearly creates a huge amount of demand for DRAM and non-memory demand, etc. So China, as for the Huawei, it is one of the most competitive and probably effective 5G equipment producers in a global scale. So with this news of the Huawei actually be able to get some parts from U.S., that will be definitely positive news for the overall global economy. We'd like to see more association between U.S. and China in regards to this. Clearly, improvement of trade side is definitely positive news. I think that current trade dispute can be a long-term process in terms of trying to win the first position in terms of the fourth industrial revolutions. But I think that the negotiation has to happen continuously because you cannot really just invest in all type of fourth industrial revolution related products. So I think that this will be definitely positive news going forward.
Well, now here in Korea, there's a lot of money moving into dollars and gold. The Bank of Korea says dollar balances in June were at their highest since last November. Why is that, and how long will this go on?
Well, I mean, with the Korean economic growth rate being very weak, you've seen first quarter down quarter on quarter, and year on year is lowest of 1.7%. Clearly, lower interest rate environment is causing investors to put money into dollars, given that U.S. interest rate is higher than Korea. And also, as the BOK is likely to follow the suit of what U.S. is doing in terms of rate cut, then there's additional liquidity will be injected into the system, which causes the commodity price to rise accordingly. And clearly, there are concerns about currency war amongst the countries, which affects the gold price. because the gold is an alternative asset to the cash. So overall, dollar deposit as well as the gold investment are rising. Clearly, that is moving away from the traditional bond investment and trying to enter the so-called a lower risk area.
All right, Mr. Yu, that's where we'll have to leave it for now. Thanks so much for making time today.
Thank you very much.
Now, South Korea's automobile production and exports rose in the first half of this year, backed by a new lineup of SUVs from local automakers. Data released by the Trade Ministry on Tuesday show auto exports from January to June rose 2.5% on year, shipping out more than 1 million units. Most of those were so-called green cars like electric sedans and SUVs. The country's auto production also edged up 1.2% on year over the same period, with total output exceeding 2 million vehicles. Changes are coming to South Korean workplaces. A new law takes effect today meant to prevent workplace bullying, things like forcing people to drink alcohol or fetch coffee. The new law will give people legal protection from such behavior. Lee Seung-jae reports.
Constant messages from your boss after clocking out for the day. Being forced to drink copious amounts of alcohol because you were late to a company dinner. Being told to make coffee for everyone because you're a female worker. All these forms of harassment that were once overlooked, even condoned in South Korea, are now punishable under a new workplace anti-bullying law, which took effect Tuesday after a 6-month grace period. While physical and sexual assault within the workplace are already handled in the legal domain in South Korea, harassment has mostly been overlooked until now. The new law stipulates that workplace bullying is defined as incurring physical or mental suffering or worsening the work environment when employers or workers use their status or power and act beyond the proper scope of work.
This law covers all workers, so even when an employee harasses another employee, the law protects the victim regardless.
If workplace bullying is reported, employers are required to immediately investigate it and take proper actions to help the victim or victims. If retaliatory measures are taken against the victims who reported the harassment, employers could face up to 3 years behind bars and a fine of up to $25,000. However, the law does not stipulate the appropriate punishment for the perpetrator, which legal analysts say is the law's weak point. A separate law also took effect on Tuesday. It stipulates that stress stemming from workplace bullying is considered an industrial disaster and allows for compensation. The new anti-bully law is expected to root out so-called 갑질 in the workplace in South Korea. 갑질, a recently coined word, refers to abusive acts by people in positions of power or those under their influence. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Now, as people start taking their summer vacations, South Korea's foreign ministry is asking travelers to stay safe by checking the risk of disease at destinations abroad and to get the required vaccinations. Park Se-young has more.
When planning your summer vacation, there are a few things you have to consider beyond what to pack in your suitcase. It's important to protect oneself from diseases specific to the region, and one must also check for the recommended travel vaccinations. The number of measles cases is spiking in the United States, European countries, and Asian countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines. About 229,000 cases were reported worldwide in 2018 compared to 170,000 in 2017. Those traveling to countries where measles has been reported should get 2 doses of the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines spaced at least 28 days apart. The entire vaccination sequence should be completed at least 2 weeks prior to departure. When traveling to tropical destinations, travelers should be aware of diseases carried by mosquitoes like yellow fever, dengue, and malaria. Yellow fever vaccine is both needed and recommended when traveling to parts of South America and Africa. Travelers should schedule a vaccination appointment at least 10 days prior to departure to make sure they develop antibodies against the disease. Vaccination certificates are required to enter countries like Panama, Guyana, and Ivory Coast. Since there are no vaccines available to prevent dengue, those traveling to Southeast Asia should take precautions to avoid mosquito bites. Wearing repellent, long-sleeve shirts, and long, bright-colored pants can help keep mosquitoes away. Travelers are also being advised to watch what they eat and drink while on vacation. It's best to avoid raw food or street food, and it's important to wash your hands frequently with soap and hot water. Park Se-young, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.